It has been 3 years since Game of Thrones wrapped up, and in its 8-season run, it had some great highs where audiences were just fawning over the show left and right, and some pretty low lows, leaving a lot of people disappointed in its lackluster ending that many felt a little rushed and not fully planned out. But here we are in 2022, going back to George R.R. Martin's world of Westeros to examine House Targaryen in HBO's new series, House of the Dragon. And while many might be coming into this series with a little bit of caution after the heartbreak that was Game of Thrones, I think that there is a lot of good here in this pilot episode, and that's what I want to talk about. And just to let you know where I am coming from as a Game of Thrones fan, I actually didn't watch the series while it was running. I watched it for the first time last year, and being a huge fantasy nerd as I was, I can't believe I missed out on it, but I'm glad that I did go through and watch it. And coming into this, I have seen the series one time through, and I have read the first 2 books in the Song of Ice and Fire series. And with my experience and exposure to the Game of Thrones series, let's jump into a non-spoiler overview of what I thought of this episode in general. Throughout the pilot, we are introduced to the various different characters that we're definitely going to be seeing a lot more of throughout this series, and in this first episode, we get a little understanding of each character's motivations, their purposes, and what type of role they're probably going to play going forward. And throughout the whole entire show, you can definitely feel that it is very high quality. The way that it is shot, directed, the writing, all feels very good as you're watching it, and I find it to be pretty engaging. It took a little while to get going and to get really interesting, but once the episode picks up pace about 15 to 20 minutes in, it is very gripping, and you're very into the events going on and really trying to figure out what part each character is going to play. And the thing that this show does well in its first episode, and what Game of Thrones did well, was introducing you to characters who there's going to be some you like and some that you don't like, and a lot that you're just kind of on the fence of, trying to figure out what is this person's grand master plan. And that's really what makes these shows engaging and interesting, is the political intrigue that is bound to happen going forward. I actually found this first episode has a lot of similarities with Game of Thrones' first episode, putting all of the characters in a familiar place, being introduced to all the players you're going to see in the series going forward, and then giving you an event that is obviously going to affect how everybody goes about their business going forward. And I know that this is very vague and non-spoilery, but this is for anyone who's just kind of looking for a general recommendation on whether or not I think you should watch it. And I believe if you have HBO Max, it's definitely worth your time and checking out, and it is enjoyable and well done. However, if you couldn't get into Game of Thrones, or you thought it was too brutal, too violent, or too much sexuality, that type of stuff is still here. So if that is kind of off-putting to you, I feel like you're getting the same type of stuff with House of the Dragon. The reality is that this type of stuff just isn't for everybody, and that's okay. But in general, if you like fantasy, you like political intrigue, it looks like House of the Dragon is off to a solid start. So I do want to talk about more of the specific aspects of the show, and for that I am going to have to give a spoiler warning. I am going to be talking about pretty much everything that happened in this episode that I felt was significant, and just kind of how it stuck with me, pointing out what I think was done really well, and then pointing out some critiques that I have of the show, which, to be completely honest, I don't have a ton of critiques of this first episode because I think it was really well done. So first, I'm going to start off by talking about what worked in this episode. And I thought the overarching story of the episode was very good, being introduced to our characters in a state where the king is looking forward to the birth of a son. They're having a celebration in order to celebrate the birth of a son, even though he doesn't know the gender of the baby yet. He's already celebrating that it is going to be a male. And there is a big tournament, and this scene is done so well, and it's really the high point of the episode, even though it is so tragic. We are introduced to this tournament where knights are going in, they're having lance battles back and forth. For the most part, it starts off as a typical tournament where whoever gets knocked off the horse is the victor of that round. They move on in the tournament. But as the day goes on, the fights get more brutal and you're introduced to this extremely graphic, violent side of these tournaments and this culture. And while this is all going on, King Viserys is having to go see his wife who is in labor, a moment that he was excited about that all too quickly becomes very stressful and tragic, having to make a decision without his wife's consent on whether or not the doctors should try to keep the baby alive or allow the gods to make the decision, as the Maester puts it. And so Viserys decides to allow the maesters and the medical staff to go forward and try to take the baby out of his wife's womb. Obviously, this wasn't an easy choice for him, but it definitely wasn't really gone about in the right way. And we, as the audience members, are supposed to feel that. And all while this is happening, the tournament is going on, and we're introduced to Daemon Targaryen, the brother of the king, who is this cocky prince who thinks that he's just going to easily win this tournament. And you're introduced here to a weakness within each of the two Targaryen men. Daemon, his cockiness overcomes him, and he ends up losing the final battle because he thought that he had won before his enemy yielded, and he ends up losing to a man from Dorne, and the king ends up losing his wife and his son because of his obsession with getting a male heir. I thought that this whole scene within the show was done so well, and it reminded me that there is still a lot of good things that can be done in making television. And when you do have the big budgets of HBO and the talent that they've had for many years, it's really nice to get something like this. But the next thing I want to talk about are the characters. I think that all of the characters who were introduced in this episode were all interesting in their own way. And that's what made Game of Thrones so good, was its wide cast of dynamic characters. And it's with House of the Dragon that I hope we can get that same type of thing. And I think all of the characters are interesting in the way that they're introduced. Daemon is this very brutal type of character who very much wants the throne, who seems to have love for his family, but he's a very disturbing individual. He seems to have some principles in place, but he definitely feels like he's out of line. King Viserys seems to just be so fixated and obsessed with getting an heir. It doesn't end up happening. He loses his wife, but he has this daughter whom he does love and who he does decide to choose to be his successor, and realizes that that was the right decision to make. And maybe if he thought about life a little different, he wouldn't be without his wife. And that's one thing that I really enjoyed about his character in particular, is outside of that one moment, I actually think that Viserys is somewhat of a respectable king, right? Wanting to rule a kingdom in peace, not really being a brutal figure, not being a warlord, but seems to care about his people, cares about his family, but his obsession with getting an heir was his one major flaw. And I think going forward, we are going to see a very, very broken king. And I think that exposes him to potentially losing the Iron Throne. And we have Rhaenyra, who is our lead female character of the show, who is the princess, the daughter of the king, who is a free-spirited soul who wants to have adventure, ride on dragons, go places, see the world. And maybe life at court just isn't her ideal, but because of all of the things that happen, she now finds herself in a position to where she is the rightful successor to her father's throne. And we'll find out as the show goes on if that's something that she's really glad about and wants, or if it's something that holds her back from the life that she desires. We're introduced to the Hand of the King, who we find out very quickly is probably a bit of a slime ball and somebody who's trying to undercut the king. There are family members within the House Targaryen who probably feel cheated out of the throne, and we'll see how that all plays in. And so we get just enough of all the characters to be interested in what is going to happen going forward, and I think that's what makes a really good television show. Being interested in the main plot while also being very intrigued by where each character can go on this journey. Now, it is only the first episode, but I'm pretty excited to have something that's enjoyable to watch. But the show wasn't perfect. I do have a couple of critiques of the show, although I will say that they're not major. There were times where I feel like there was a bit of preachy dialogue within the show because they very much want you to get the message across, hey, this is about a culture and a time where it was very misogynistic and life was very difficult for women. And I think that those can be powerful storytelling elements, but I feel like maybe there were times where they really kind of tried to talk at you rather than conveying that through the show itself, because I feel like you see that fully on display when the queen ends up dying in labor, and you really have a broken heart in that whole instance because it's just so terrible how it all went down, especially after years and years of trying to have a baby and then just having a husband who's just so obsessed with producing a rightful heir with a male child. And that shows the downfalls of that ideology fully on display for the audience to take in, and they don't need to be told that's what the message is. They can see it. And my next critique of the show is that in this first episode, it really didn't give us that Game of Thrones moment of shock value that the show became synonymous with. We didn't get that Bran getting pushed off the tower moment that just had your jaw drop to the floor when you watched the first episode of Game of Thrones. We didn't get anything like that. I felt like the episode itself was pretty predictable. I don't want to say predictable, but you weren't necessarily surprised by anything that happened. That doesn't mean that that stuff isn't coming, but definitely in this first one, they kind of missed an opportunity to suck us all back in fully by not giving us that type of moment at the conclusion or close to the conclusion of the episode. But overall, I thought this first episode of House of the Dragon was done pretty well. It's a high-quality show that is definitely worth watching. It's a show that looks like it's going to be all about characters and giving us different perspectives from all the different characters and really kind of arguing over the water cooler on who's going to do what, who's going to do this, and those are the fun types of things that can happen with a show that is engaging like this. I definitely recommend watching it, and if you've made it to the end of this review, you've already heard some spoilers on it, but thank you so much for watching. My final score on this show is I'm giving the first episode a 4 out of 5. I'm not going all the way up to 5 out of 5 because there were some flaws. It wasn't perfect, but I really enjoyed it, and I really look forward to seeing where the show can go in the next couple of weeks. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'll be reviewing every episode of House of the Dragon. We got Rings of Power coming out. There's a lot of good stuff coming out that I'm looking forward to talking about, and I'd love to know what you all think about the show in the comments down below. For now, I'm signing out, and I'll talk to you next time on Parallel Quest. Bye-bye.